be here with you this morning. Just great to worship here this morning. Great to have the opportunity to be here. As Alan mentioned a moment ago, that I've known Alan for a long time, but I haven't seen Alan a lot over the years, and so there's a real disconnect in my mind mentally as I think about the Alan and Michelle that I knew. Michelle was our oldest son's first babysitter, and so there was when we were first married, Ethan was 6 months old, and I had decided that I was going to do something very special for my wife's birthday, and I was going to take her out for supper, booked a bed and breakfast hotel, and had a nice meal, everything was all planned out. Michelle was going to come and stay overnight with Ethan, and so Michelle shows up at 3:30. I said to Wendy, as she knew we were going out, it was her birthday, I said, you might want to pack some clothes, and because we're staying overnight. Well, she had never left Ethan for more than 3 hours. As a new first-time mom, now if you've ever been in that situation, you might understand the consternation that she now felt and then poured out on me. I learned at that moment that she didn't like surprises, even good ones. And it took most of the evening for her to begin to relax, but we knew that Ethan was in good hands. And so it was a beautiful day. So I've known Alan and Michelle for a long time. Our oldest son is now 30, but still in my mind, Alan and Michelle are still somewhere in their early to mid 20s.
My mind too.
Yeah. So regardless of how you act, so it's good to be here. My name is Jeff Friesen. I'm a pastor of Hebron Bible Church in Hebron, Nebraska. My wife and I have been there in Hebron for the last 21 years, where we've planted a church, Hebron Bible Church, and our church is part of a fellowship called the Fellowship of Evangelical Bible Churches. And that fellowship, if you scratch the roots, you get Mennonite roots. So the original name of the fellowship was the Evangelical Mennonite Brethren. And in 1986, they changed the name of the fellowship to the FEBC, and we have ministered within that fellowship since 1995, when we left Indiana to go back to Nebraska in 2 different churches. And one of the things that I'm doing in my own ministry is learning what it looks like to find rest even in the midst of a very busy time that God has put in front of us for ministry. And that initially has a lot to do with where we pick up the story in the Gospel of Mark. Now, Alan had asked me if I would be okay with just kind of picking up the series that you've been working through in the Gospel of Mark, and I said, sure. I shouldn't have said sure. I should have said, I want to preach something I've already preached before. That would have been wise. But now I face both an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that I don't know what was said before. So if I repeat something that you've already heard, I'm sorry. Now the advantage is that if I happen to steal somebody else's thunder, I'm not sorry. You have to adjust to what I'm about to say. So before we turn to Mark chapter 6, which is our text this morning, I would like to, for my own purposes, begin our time in Mark chapter 1, which is the very beginning of Mark's gospel. And if you've not done so recently, I would like to remind us that Mark has a purpose in writing his story. And that purpose is bound up in the very first line of Mark's gospel, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. Mark has a purpose in writing to present to us Jesus, the Messiah, the promised one, the anointed one, the Son of God. Now, it's very interesting if you think about when Mark was writing. Historically, writing at a time when Nero was probably on the throne in Rome, probably writing in Rome. He is described by the early church fathers as kind of the interpreter of Peter. And so Peter is recounting the story. Mark writes it down for a very Roman audience. Now, there's a very curious thing that began to happen about 100 years before the birth, before this time that Mark was writing. And that was the death of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, you guys heard of him? Right? Even from Shakespeare or whatever, right? Et tu, Brute, right? Beware the Ides of March, all of those sorts of fun historical bits, where he was, closely set upon by 23 of his closest friends. And when Julius Caesar died, his nephew, Octavian, made a name for himself by declaring that he had seen Caesar's star rise from the ashes of his funeral pyre and take his place within the heavens. So, and that began a time period when all of the Roman emperors began to proclaim their own deity. Well, and actually they didn't quite do it like that. Because Octavian, who we know as Caesar Augustus, never claimed himself to be God, and none of his followers ever claimed themselves to be God, but they would proclaim their fathers to be God after they died, and so then they would print on their coins the Latin phrase divi filius, which means the son of a god. And so at this time, Nero, who probably had something to do with the poisoning of his stepfather, Clodius, who was reported on his deathbed after he'd been poisoned, said, "Oh, I think I'm becoming a god." That was the way he said it. Nero has coins printed with his likeness on it that are emblazoned with the phrase, divi filius, son of a god. In contrast to Nero's proclamation, Mark begins his gospel with a presentation. He said, "No, you all think that Caesar has these coins printed, that Nero has these coins printed that call him the son of a god. Here is the gospel, the good news of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God." And so often when we dive into the stories of Jesus, we can look at them as historical events which they were, or moral lessons which they can provide, and forget that Mark's purpose in writing is to point to the Creator God who stepped into history and changed everything. His purpose is not that we would learn more about Jesus, but that we'd come to recognize Jesus as the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark's point is that we would see Jesus for who he is, the glorious, eternal, second person of the triune Godhead. One author writes this. He says, what the author John in his gospel does by telling, Mark does by showing. And Mark does this by way of a series of stories that are arranged to tell a bigger story of who Jesus is and how he's revealed himself to us. There are at least three threads of the storyline as Jesus interacted with different groups of people. There are the crowds, there are the authorities, and the disciples. And in each part of the story, Jesus is working, he's leading, he's responding to, sometimes each group in a different way, sometimes in the same story. Now, since the primary story that we'll be looking at focuses on the disciples, we will be pulling this thread this morning through chapter 6 on our way to the shore of Galilee. And so I did notice, as we were talking about Jesus walking on the water this morning, that we were singing songs that had a nautical feel to them. We're almost home, we're almost to the shore, we're almost home. By the way, in the early church, the anchor was an early symbol for Christianity because in Greek the word onkoros, which means anchor, sounded a lot like the Greek phrase onkurios, which means in the Lord. And so the anchor became an early symbol for Christianity. So I love the songs with the nautical flavor. And this morning, while we're imagining what it will be like to walk with Jesus, we're going to imagine ourselves in this story as we see Jesus walking across the waves. So if you're there with me in Mark chapter 6, we see the story continue to unfold. And we're going to focus particularly on how Jesus is leading his disciples in ministry. Already in this chapter we see a flow and a series of contrasts between how Jesus is being received by others. And ironically, the ones who should have known him best were least impressed by the things he was doing. The people in his own town and even his disciples at times failed to see what God is doing. At the beginning of Mark chapter 6, Jesus is rejected at Nazareth. Immediately following that statement that they couldn't do any miracles there because of their unbelief, he sends the 12 out to do ministry. And that story is then interrupted by the question about who Jesus is that is circling through the community, even through the courts of Herod. At which point, Mark interrupts that story to tell another story. This time about the death of John the Baptist. That story ends with a statement that John the Baptist's body was retrieved by his disciples and buried. And perhaps this is a bit of a foreshadowing of what the disciples of Jesus would experience later on. Now, on the one hand, we're compelled to ask the question, what is the story of Herod doing here? Why is it slowing down our story? Now, we won't take time to dwell on the number of ironies here because Mark transitions from the story of John the Baptist by telling us that John's disciples gathered his body. And then John says, well, speaking of disciples, and Mark picks up the story with the disciples telling Jesus what happened in their ministries. Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus, and they told him all that they had done and taught. Notice that they had gone out to ministry, they'd come back, and then we interrupt that story. There's a verbal speed bump, a narrative speed bump to tell the story of Herod. And all the time we're waiting. What's going to happen? What do the disciples do? And then they just told Jesus, so this is what we did. At a busy time in ministry, notice here how the disciples were responding. And Jesus said to them, verse 30, come away by yourselves and rest to a desert place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat, and they went away to a boat to a desolate place by themselves. The desolate place there is the word desert. Come away, Jesus says, to the desert. Now, there are so many hints here in this story of another person who led other people to a desert to find rest. And I think Mark is very intentional in telling us and describing how the disciples were led by Jesus, compelled to go into the desert in order to find rest. And rest is a huge concept within the context of Scripture. It's a fantastic theme that runs throughout the entire Old Testament. As one and time again, God is holding out a promise of rest to his people. Now, rest is not just simply a matter of cessation of activities. It's not like taking a Sunday afternoon nap, right? How many people take a Sunday afternoon nap? Okay, how many take a Sunday afternoon nap but they don't want to lift their hands? All right? I don't want to admit to anyone else that I'm actually resting, because that's the American way. You know, when I grew up on the farm, one of the worst things that you could tell a farm kid was that he was lazy. That was the worst insult you could ever give us. So we didn't want to admit taking a rest ever. But it's okay. Because rest is what God calls us into, because He has not designed us to run 24/7. And so here the disciples are doing, they're running around, they're doing ministry, and Jesus said to them, come away and rest. And so they get in the boat and they go over to this other place, to the desert, to rest, and then a crowd of people shows up, and God provides bread from nothing. Again, hints here. The manna in the desert to the people of Israel, provided by the Good Shepherd, Moses, to the bread given to the people in the desert, provided by the Good Shepherd, Jesus. And in this way, the tragic feasting at Herod's opulent table, filled with contention, is contrasted by the simple meal in the desert, born of compassion. A meal that truly satisfies, and abundantly so. Though Jesus offers rest to His disciples, out of compassion He gives rest to the people. But the upshot of this desert feast means that there's no rest for the disciples, right? And so Jesus sends them away ahead of Him to the other side of the sea. Verse 45. And here we pick up our story for this morning. And immediately, He made His disciples get into the boat and go before Him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while He dismissed the crowd. Now, some scholars see a bit of urgency in Jesus' dismissing of the disciples here, supposing that He was trying to quell a messianic uprising. And they bring in shades of John chapter 6 into this discussion. But Mark uses this word immediately 35 times in his gospel as a way of moving the story along. And so I don't think that that is Mark's intent here. He sends the disciples off, then verse 46, Jesus says, and after He had taken leave of them, He went up to the mountain to pray. That's one of 3 times, and Jesus goes off to the mountain in the Gospel of Mark to pray by Himself. In chapter 1, after the temptation narrative, and in chapter 6 here, and then in chapter 14, before He goes to the cross. Verse 47, and when evening had came, or late evening had come, the boat was out to sea, and He was alone on the land. So now Mark sets up our story for this morning. And now that he has put all of the elements on the table, he begins describing what happens next. Verse 48, Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Now, as I was reading this, I was thinking about Peter, potentially the primary source for Mark's gospel, again, who was a fisherman. Now, I'm not a fisherman. I did own a sailboat for about a dozen years, even though the closest body of water to where we live in Nebraska is about 45 miles away, and so I had very few opportunities to actually put it into the water. Are you boat people here? Yeah, I mean, when we were in Indiana, there were like lakes everywhere, and so boats are everywhere, and there were boat people everywhere. I grew up in Nebraska and West Texas, where there were no lakes, and we were horse people. Even though that we lived near a lake, we spent our Sunday afternoons on horses. And so some of these things I only learned in the last dozen or so years when I began sailing that little 14-foot sailboat in whatever body of water that I could put it into. And I'm talking puddles, right? Some of the puddles that I put our sailboat into were not much bigger than this building. And what that meant was that I ended up sailing in circles until we tipped over, which is what you do when you don't know how to sail. But what I did learn was this, is that it's difficult to sail into the wind. And you know that. And so you do different things. And now the disciples here were rowing the boat strenuously because the wind was against them. Several years ago, a friend of mine said, hey, I want to build up myself. I want to I want to ride my bicycle. I want to do that more. I'm trying to ride. I've got a goal to ride to Lincoln and back, and there's 90 miles to go to Lincoln. And so it would have been a 180-mile round trip. And I said, well, I'm game for helping you train. And so we were biking together, and we'd ride up to Geneva, which is about 25 miles north of us. And this was a training run, so we were up there 25 miles. We stopped, we have a bite to eat, we turn around and head back, and realized at that moment that we had been riding with a 25-mile tailwind coming north. And now that 25-mile-an-hour tailwind was now a 25-mile-an-hour headwind. And 10 miles later, we gave up. It's like, I was pedaling in first gear on my mountain bike. I was pedaling. There were pigeons that were walking, that were passing me up. It's like, not going to fly in this wind. What are you doing? I'm trying. So, finally, made the call, got rescued. And so the disciples were strenuously rowing. Jesus sees them out there, and the wind was against them. And I note this is kind of a sailor's observation. Peter was a fisherman. He knew what it was like to be in a boat where the wind was against you. It was tough slogging. Now, if you imagine the disciples, already tired from their time of ministry, had just gotten done rowing across to feed the 5,000, got sent away to go back on the lake in the middle of the night, rowing all night long. Matthew tells us 3 or 4 miles out from shore. And they were hard at it. Verse 48 continues, and about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea, and he meant to pass by them. The 4th watch of the sea would have been between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So these events had unfolded during a long, long, long day. The disciples had had no rest. They were exhausted. And Jesus comes to them walking on the sea, and he meant to pass them by. Verse 49, when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. So, now again, these were sailors. Many of them were fishermen. They'd been at the Sea of Galilee at night most of their lives. And for them to be terrified of something, that was something unusual that happened. It wasn't something that you always saw, right? Now, I've got a great imagination. I've got so great of an imagination that when I'm out by myself in the dark, even in a place that I know really, really well, I can imagine all sorts of things that are out there with me. Whether they're there or not is beside the point. When I was growing up, we grew up on a pig farm out in western Nebraska, and our farm was about 8 miles outside of town, and there were no outdoor lights at this pig farm, and there were times when my dad would say, hey, I want you to go to check on these pigs, the sows farrowing, whatever, and I'd go out there, do the thing I was supposed to do, and I was walking back to my car, pitch black, at night, no moon, and then all of a sudden I can imagine there's a werewolf that's just going to bound out of the cornfield and grab a hold of me. Or I get into my car and I start driving. I just know that there's a snake that somehow got into my car and is going to wrap itself around my feet. And I would put the hammer down. So, all that is to say that I've got a great imagination. It doesn't take much to make you scared when it's night. But now the disciples see Jesus walking across the sea. They don't know that it's Jesus walking across the sea. The word here is kind of a phantasm. It is kind of a phantom. They think he's a ghost. Not Jesus. They don't know it's Jesus. They think that there's a ghost, and they are absolutely terrified. Now, here's the thing. We get frightened sometimes. And there have been times when I've been in fear for how what was going to happen. When was I going to survive a certain situation? When we've all had those close calls where there were life and death situations, and those real situations, and on top of that, we all have times when we've imagined ourselves in life and death situations, right? And we think about, what am I going to do? What would I do in this sort of situation? How would I respond? How would I react? And so we can imagine some of the things the disciples might have been thinking. But here's the thing, we're so often scared of the things that we can see that seem to threaten our lives that we take no concern about the things that would threaten our soul. Jesus here comes walking to them in the night, and they're greatly terrified. Now, one of the questions we're not going to ask is how. That's a question that a lot of people ask. Well, how did Jesus do this? I had a guy once in my office. He came to my office. We were pastoring in Lincoln, and he got to my office. He said, "Pastor," and honestly, I don't know exactly what led him into my office to begin with, because he led with this. I don't necessarily believe in God. I don't think I believe in God. And I think that Jesus was an alien, and that he did his miracles through the use of superior alien technology. And that's how we started the conversation. And so I said for a second, well, okay, all right, so the idea that our life on this planet has been seeded from alien technology and from aliens in other worlds is not a new theory. Francis Crick, the Watson and Crick, the guys that discovered DNA, he believed in something called the directed panspermia, where aliens spread this biological DNA across the universe, and then it landed places and it developed. He thought that was more plausible than the idea that God may have created something. But I pointed out to this man, his name was Doug, I said, well, Doug, all of that does is removes your problem one generation. If the aliens put life on this planet, where did the aliens come from? If it took 4 billion years, according to your idea, for life to develop on this planet to get to the point where we are today, well, then it would take, presumably, 4 billion years for life to develop on another planet to get to that point. So where did they come from? You have not solved the problem. All you've done is removed it one generation, evolutionarily speaking. And eventually you run out of time if this universe is only 16 billion years old. So at some point, you have to have non-life becoming life. You have to have an uncaused first cause that causes everything else, and that we Christians call God. And He created everything, and He left the office a believer in Jesus. He started attending our church. It was really cool to see God begin to work as He began to grow in His understanding. They see Jesus, so we're not going to answer the question, how did Jesus do this? Because we're not told how. We're just told He was walking on the sea. And Jesus speaks peace to the disciples. He climbs into the boat and the wind ceases. And the Mark writes that they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Now, that's a curious phrase, right? And it seems like a non sequitur. Almost like talking to Roger sometimes. It's like, I love Roger. Roger is my boss and my supervisor and a mentor to me for a lot of years. So I pick on him because I know he can take it. So what does that have to do with anything that happens before? They were utterly astounded because they didn't understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Now we'll come back to that in a moment. Right now, there's no time. For the moment they come back to the land, they're mobbed again. And Jesus' compassion for the people is shown in healing. And this is a summary statement in Mark beginning in verse 53. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored there to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages and countryside, they laid the sick on the marketplace and implored him that he might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. The running about like sheep without a shepherd that we see earlier in the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is recalled here, and Jesus begins to heal. This is kind of a side note, but the contrast between Herod and Jesus is striking. Herod, at the center of this chapter, who as king was supposed to be caring for the people, but really only wanted to please others. And Jesus, who as king really did care for the needs of the people by healing them. The word here is the word to save. And in doing so, Jesus was modeling the sort of shepherd that Jeremiah spoke about, a shepherd who would care for the flock in Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 4, when the Lord says, I will set shepherds over them who will care for them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord. So far as our story. But now we begin to ask the question, what are some of the implications for us about the story that Mark tells us? And again, the question isn't how, as in how did Jesus do this walking on the water bit, but why? Surely the answer isn't just practical, right? Jesus needed to get from here to there, and the water was between them, so he just walked. 3 of the 4 gospel writers found this story, this event, so significant, they included it in their narrative. Why? What does this reveal about Jesus? Well, as we begin to answer that question, there are a couple of phrases I want to dial in on, and I want to begin toward the end and move back through the passage. Start back in verse 50. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, take courage, be encouraged, it is I. I am. Do not be afraid. Jesus speaks words of comfort to his disciples. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Verse 52, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Let's look at that again. They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. There's only one other time in the Gospel of Mark where this phrase, their hearts were hardened, shows up, and that's in chapter 8, beginning in verse 17. Also, following an account where Jesus had fed people. Mark chapter 8, verse 17, if you're there, if you turn with me there. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, the disciples, and they only had 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another, they had no bread. The disciples again are misunderstanding what Jesus was trying to say. And Jesus, being aware of this, said, why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Do you not perceive, or do you not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes to see, do you not see? And having ears, do you hear? To hear, do you not hear? Now he's quoting the book of Isaiah at this point. When Isaiah said, in Isaiah chapter 6, to Isaiah, keep on speaking to this people, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and repent and be forgiven. So Jesus is asking his disciples, are you in the same spot as all of the people of Israel who listened to Isaiah preach? Are you there? Having seen what you've seen, are your hearts hardened? Do you not remember? And now he brings up these 2 feedings. Do you not remember when When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said, do you not yet understand? Now, again, this is a curious and difficult phrase because Mark never really fully explains what Jesus is trying to get at here. But there are a couple of points to bring out. 2 years ago, I was on sabbatical, and when I had begun my sabbatical, I was absolutely, utterly exhausted. And so I took 3 months off. The church very graciously gave me 3 months off, and I knew I needed to spend that time finding what it meant to rest, but also to learn how to do ministry differently so that rest would become part of my regular cycle of life so that I wouldn't get to the point that I was exhausted again. And one of the things I did that summer was I read through the Gospel of Mark in my Greek New Testament. And in my margin of my notes for Mark chapter 6 that I wrote that summer, I wrote this question here. Is a consequence of being tired in ministry that you're no longer, is one of the consequences of being tired in ministry is that you're no longer astounded when God works. Think about the disciples again. They were exhausted. They'd been working. They'd gone out to do ministry, and they came back to do ministry. From doing ministry, Jesus said, come away and rest. And they went away to rest, and they didn't rest. They had to serve all day long. And when they got done serving, Jesus said, go over there. And they left. And it's interesting to note that all of the time the disciples were discussing with Jesus when he says, you give them something to eat. No. You get them. Where are we going to find bread? It's like, oh, come on, Jesus. You know how tired we are? Where are we going to find money to buy bread for even these people to have a morsel? Don't you get it? And Jesus said, no, you don't get it. What do you have? 5 loaves. 2 fish. And so what's interesting is that if we pull our analogy from the people of Israel forward to the disciples, who are the disciples like? At this point, the children of Israel, who when they got bread every day, which was called manna, it's like, really, God? Don't we have anything else to eat? Just this manna, which literally means, what is it? We don't even know what it is. We get it every day. Can't we get something else to eat? The disciples here are reacting like the children of Israel in disobedience when God says they will not enter into my rest. For 40 years I put up with them in the desert. And that prevented the disciples from seeing how Jesus brought bread for 5,000 people out of virtually nothing. They were so tired, they didn't see who Jesus was. One author says their problem was a Christological one. And Jesus censors them for being only amazed when they should have moved beyond the stage of astonishment to one of understanding of who Jesus is. That phrase, if we go back a little bit further to where it says that Jesus was intending to pass them by. Now, that's a curious